At what age, and you talked about this in your question, at what age do young women, or in fact girls, start to feel as though they are not, that engineering is not going to be a potential career for them? And uh, the Engendering Success in STEM Research Consortium has identified that that can happen as early as 6 or 7 years old.
Hi everyone, my name's Alexandra and I'm a civil engineering student. In today's episode, we'll be continuing our discussion on addressing the gender gap, but this time we'll be looking at it more on a federal level and seeing how Canada is working on this issue. So joining us today are some amazing representatives from Engineers Canada, Cassandra Polyzou and Jeanette Southwood. Jeanette is an award-winning engineer and vice president of corporate affairs and strategic partnerships, and Cassandra is the manager of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's safe to say that they are well-versed in this topic, and we're so excited to have them on today. Thank you, Cassandra and Jeanette, for being here, and welcome.
Thanks very much for the invitation to be here today.
So I'll start with the first question, and what I believe, if we really want to see how Canada is doing in terms of this topic, I think it would be good to look at maybe the percentages of how many, what is the percentage of women licensed engineers who are women in Canada, and how do we compare to other countries in the world?
So there are 42,565 female identifying engineering members, representing 14.2% of the total national membership in 2020. And that's an increase of 13.9% from 2019. We're
Oh, wow.
in the yeah, it was really good to see. We're in the process of collecting our 2021 data now, and by about the end of Q2 2022, we'll have new numbers for everybody.
That's an amazing increase from 1 year. So I think that gives us a little more confidence in what we can actually do on a yearly basis and not necessarily, oh, it might take 5 years to do something like this. So very reassuring, especially as someone studying or a woman studying in engineering. I think I'm really hopeful, at least for Canada and where we can bring this. And I think it does represent that maybe we are doing some good stuff and we are doing something right in terms of addressing this.
Yes, absolutely. A question that we're often asked is, how does this percentage vary from province to province? And it varies considerably. In some provinces, for 2020, it was 11.4%. In other provinces, it was over 15%, close to 16%. However, in some of our smaller provinces, just the fact that there are fewer female members means that even an addition of one or two brand new female members increases the percentage considerably. And similarly, the move by one or two female members from one province to another could reduce the percentage considerably.
Yeah, I would only add there that that this looking at the entire membership can be kind of disheartening in some ways because you have folks who are senior and have been in their careers for more than 30 or 40 years, then that's really skewing towards a male dominant profession. And so I know we'll talk a little bit more about 30 by 30, but just in terms of looking at metrics that can show us more of the current progress, like what are universities doing, how are regulators responding now, and that will relate more to the newly licensed engineers. So we'll give you some of that data in a little bit, but we certainly are keeping track of this, and the regulators do look at this themselves, and we're very thankful for the regulators for sending us this kind of data and keeping track of their membership in this way. It is very, very important in terms of understanding what is the representation and how does that then reflect on the profession and the workplace.
Absolutely. So, what is Engineers Canada doing, and how are they working with individual governments?
Because Engineers Canada is a national organization, we focus our government relations work on federal government advocacy. And equity, diversity, and inclusion is one of Engineers Canada's key policy priorities. So, what that means is that we provide input to the federal government and recommendations to the federal government through policy specific submissions, through meetings with senators, ministers, MPs, members of parliament, and political staff, and also through presentations to House of Commons standing committees and the Senate. We have other key policy priorities also. However, equity, diversity, and inclusion is one of our top ones.
And it's amazing to see this kind of collaboration happening. And as you mentioned, Cassandra, yes, Engineers Canada does have an initiative called 30 by 30. I think it's an amazing initiative. And so I guess the goal in this, if I'm not mistaken, is to get 30% of newly licensed engineers to be women by 2030.
Yes, absolutely. And it's an initiative that started out with our Alberta regulator, the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta, also known as APEGA. They started the initiative as a province specific initiative in 2010. And it was then adopted a few years later by Engineers Canada as a national goal. And the reason that 30% was selected is because it's considered to be the tipping point for sustainable change. So research indicates that reaching 30 by 30 typically helps drive a shift in sustainable change and making change that will continue. And so we felt that 30 by 30 will drive the shift in the overall membership of the engineering profession as more and more women continue to enter the profession. Something that I should have mentioned, and you were talking about some good news about the percentages, is that we had quietly set an interim goal of 20% by 2020, so essentially 20 by 20. And we reached that goal last year. Last year, for 2020, we had 20.6% newly licensed engineers who are female identifying. And for us, that was a real point of celebration because we had hoped that we would reach 2020 or 20 by 20, and we did. So we feel much more confident that 30 by 30 is within our grasp.
I know I did actually look into, I asked Concordia what just as a university, how are we doing? And we're actually at 22% of women in undergraduate engineering studies. So right there, I think the goal, I can see the goals being achieved even at university levels and not necessarily just entire provinces, but we're seeing it also on smaller levels. So absolutely, the fact that we made it to 20 by 20 is encouraging that we might make it to 30 by 30. So yeah, that's amazing. And just what I was wondering too, when you say newly licensed engineers, could you clarify what is meant by that? Does that mean a professional engineer?
So when we speak about newly licensed engineers, we're speaking about engineers that have obtained their license or individuals that have obtained their license for the very first time. So this could be a PEng, this could be an ING in Quebec. And usually these are individuals that are Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board trained. So they come from one of the higher education institutions across Canada, or they could be internationally trained, or they could have obtained their license by some other route. The metric, the newly licensed engineer, does not include what we describe as interprovincial mobility applicants.
So we're not talking about junior engineers, essentially. It's after that point. It will be
Yes.
once you receive your license. Okay. So that gives us more, I guess, clarity. So it is basically you would have to first get your degree, go through junior engineering. Then once you're licensed, you will be counted towards this 30 by 30 statistics. So it's really not just getting women to get a degree, but to go so far to actually enter themselves in the industry as an engineer. So that makes more sense, and I think that is something to strive for, because we do see a lot of women who drop out either due to external factors, toxic environments, things as such. So I think it is a good goal to reach more towards merging themselves into the industry and not just getting the degree.
Yes. So part of the group that would be obtaining their license are those individuals that you described who would be graduating from a university, then going through the path to get their license. But there are some other paths that lead to becoming a newly licensed engineer also. One of them is being an internationally trained engineer. And for example, receiving a degree somewhere outside of Canada, but then going through the paths that our regulators have to get a license in Canada. And then the third path is for those who might, for example, have gotten a degree in a non-engineering discipline. So I'll use geology as an example, and then have decided that they really would like to be an engineer, but uh, they, in that case, could go to their regulator, and their regulator could provide access to courses that they would then take to work their way towards becoming licensed. So in that case, they wouldn't necessarily have to go back to university to get an engineering degree. They could follow the path that the regulator has laid out to get the uh, credentials, to get the courses in place to become licensed.
That's a good description of the nonlinear path. I think
Hmm.
we often kind of assume that, okay, once they graduate, we can just take that percentage and convert it over to licensure. But there's so much more, and we see that variance when we get survey data back from the regulators. There might be some folks who don't respond as being Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board trained engineers, and also are not foreign trained engineers. And so they're a third category. And if you talk to anyone in their career path after graduation, it isn't a linear pathway. They might choose to go somewhere else, another direction, then come back to engineering some other way and need to get additional credits or courses, or they come at it from geoscience or from physics, and so there's different ways. And we haven't done a longitudinal study or research on exactly what are the pathways and what percentage take those pathways, but we do know there are those that are on this third category. So we do try to account for those as well in our survey data.
Okay, so I didn't realize that there are other paths you can take other than just kind of the standard school junior engineering engineer. So I guess that it somewhat kind of answers my next question. If it takes someone 4 years to get their engineering degree at least, and although technically we have 8 years between now and 2030, looking at it from how long it takes to get the degree, we really would only have 4 years if we need to get the people into school so they can become an engineer. So as of right now, we would have to get our universities at 30% or even well above 30% because we know people quit. So taking all of this into consideration, are we on track to reaching the 30 by 30 goal, considering that we would have to, in 4 years, get at least 30% of schools being women in the engineering programs?
Certainly. So I can start. So based on the fact that we reached 20 by 20, we feel that that's a good indicator that we're on track to reach 30 by 30. But one of the things that we're keeping in mind is that when we first agreed and when our regulators agreed that this was going to be a national goal, that was several years before COVID. And we know that COVID is having a greater impact on women and the workforce, women and their careers. And we don't know yet whether COVID is going to have short-term and long-term impacts and what those impacts might be on women in engineering and on students in engineering. So current indicators are that we are on track, but we can't predict the impact of COVID. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that there are some universities that have reached greater than 40% enrollment for their first year programs, and they reached that greater than 40% several years ago. So their enrollment is a great indicator that certainly it's it's possible that we can continue to increase the numbers of women in undergraduate engineering programs. But that, of course, it's not universal right across Canada.
And this is, there's a lot of assumptions that we have to make when we do look and try to analyze this data. So we have two major data sets. One is from the regulators that provides us the member data. So we have information on male identifying and female identifying engineers and newly licensed engineers, and also EITs and MITs. And then we also have information from the Enrollment and Degrees Award report that we receive from the accredited universities. And that allows us to then look at the enrollment rates for female students and the graduation rates for students. Now, of course, we have some gaps in that information. For example, we don't know the difference between, who's in a first year, second year, third year. We don't have that. We just know bulk enrollment rates. And graduation, that is a number that we can then take and say, okay, so if there's this percentage of women graduating who are Canadian engineering accredited graduates, and then we take that same newly licensed Canadian engineering accredited trained newly licensed engineers, and maybe project that out 4 years. So we take the graduation numbers from 2016, and then we say, take those same numbers and try to say how many have then gotten their license in 2020, 4 years later. What we see from that, and of course, there's so many assumptions that we're making in that projection and in that analysis. We're making the assumption that it took them 4 years to get their license, which we know isn't 100% the case. Even if they're going to get their license, it might take them 4, 7, 8 years at times, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on their life choices, depending on all kinds of things, right? So life happens after graduation, and we need to acknowledge that. And we also know that for women in particular, there's lots of pauses after graduation that might be impacting them. So given that that is the case, I'll kind of backtrack and give you what we were able to project, what kind of conversion numbers, and we're looking at about 50%. 50% of those graduates say that graduate in 2016 cohort. 50% of those will potentially get their license 4 years later, is based on those numbers that we're trying to stick a stick in, but we know that everything's moving around, and we haven't done these tracking studies that would require large amounts of funding and also issues around privacy. But we kind of look at those numbers and say it's about 50%. It's also about 50% for their male colleagues from that same cohort. We take that same cohort of male graduates in 2016 from Canadian engineering accredited universities, and then compare those to the male CAB graduates who are getting their license 4 years later. It's about 50%. So that tells us that there's such a big potential there. So like to see it from the glass half full kind of perspective, that there's 50% who are graduating who are not getting their license that could potentially get their license. And so if you think of it from that perspective, and Jeanette mentioned that there are institutions now that are getting higher than the 20% enrollment, certainly higher in enrollment and also graduation. There are some that are doing really, really well. So if we take that positive piece, and we also say, what if we bump the kinds of programs that regulators are administering to those young graduates? So affirming up those relationships between the regulators and the universities, making sure that graduates have a clear pathway and relationship and see a welcoming path for themselves to get their license, that they have significant mentors who are helping them with the technical, but also navigating the workplace. So those kind of licensure assistance programs can be incredibly helpful to make sure that those young graduates do walk into the pathway of licensure, and that we bump it from 50% to higher. And hopefully that'll get us to that 30%.
Okay, yeah. So it's not as as clear cut as saying, okay, we need to have this many students enrolled, and that's where we'll get to our percentage. There's so many different factors, like you're saying, so many different pathways to get into engineering. So that's great to know that way we do have, I guess, different inlets of how people can get into the engineering industry instead of just one. So I think that's great. I think that's I learned something new from that. I wasn't aware of that, but that's great to know, and I think it reassures me more that this 30 by 30, um, we can get there. And despite COVID as well, I think just the initiative itself, I think it's actually bringing a lot of talk to the industry. So whether that goal is met or not, I think it's actually it's done some good, and it will be doing more good. So I think no matter the outcome, I believe this initiative is beneficial to the country. But going back to kind of what you were saying with other universities having almost 40% women in their engineering programs, happen to know how they were able to get to these numbers? Is it the location? Is it what the school's doing?
So we have anecdotal information on some of those schools, and we know that in some cases it is the location. They're located in larger centers where they have access to more potential students overall. We also know that some of it is what they're doing. So, for example, many of those institutions have outreach programs where they reach out into the high schools to be able to establish a stronger knowledge within the high school students of what being an engineer could be, but also what going to their institution to study engineering could be. Some of those institutions even invest in the potential students by bringing them onto their campus and taking them through a weekend of tours, meeting faculty, going through what the typical experience of engineering could be, but in a nutshell, within a few days, so that when the students do make a decision to, let's say, attend their university, it's not the first time that they would have been on that campus. It's not the first time that they would have met some of the professors. So those universities are aiming not only for higher numbers within first year, but they're also aiming for retention of those that they recruit into second, third, fourth year, or however long the program is. And their thoughts include the more familiar that a student is or a potential student is with the campus and with the faculty and with the curriculum, the greater potential that there is for those students to not only sign up for first year, but to actually stay for the entire program.
I was just going to add to those amazing points is that there's also the culture piece and the behaviors of the faculty, and also how welcoming their peers are. So I think that there's a lot of pieces around equity, diversity, and inclusion, embedding that into competencies for faculty, embedding it into training for faculty, and also embedding it into a norm for the other students. Some of the sort of anecdotal, but also some of the survey data that we see is that female students and also professionals continue to face discrimination and harassment from their peers. And so that points to us that it's not just about convincing young girls that they have a future in engineering, but it's also once they get there, once they are interested, that they're met with welcome. They're met with you can be yourself, and you don't have to fit into a particular box of what we perceive an engineer to look like and an engineer to behave. Rather that their authentic self can thrive there. And so that also relates to making sure that inclusion isn't just around gender, but rather is around a broader perspective of who is accepted. Everyone is accepted and welcome. So that includes making sure that there are spaces for Black students to gather, for Indigenous students, for engineering students of any kind of background that they feel like they've been on the margins or they're underrepresented. It's really important that we make sure that there is a clear path to that them being not just welcome, but that if they have concerns around a toxic environment, that they feel safe saying something about it as well. So it is about these kind of broader policies and equity, diversity, and inclusion that we see in society, right? Engineering needs to respond to these things, and it's not a trend. This is the way we're learning to behave, and we're learning to address and point out this is an example of bullying. This is an example of discrimination based on my race or my ethnicity, and I have somebody to talk to about it, and I feel safe. So those are the kind of behaviors and policies that we're hoping to see more and more in faculties, and also taking it to the perspective that as engineers graduating with ethics, graduating with this sense that you're going to serve a public, and that public's going to be diverse. You look around yourself in the Canadian society in 2022, we're very diverse, and there's a lot of different things in terms of social justice and in terms of rights that we need to acknowledge as professionals. So connecting those professional obligations and ethics to the environment in the post-secondary situation is also incredibly important.
It's so important that the engineering profession reflects society. And we've talked about Engineers Canada and its 30 by 30 goal. I wanted to share with you that Engineers Canada also has some other, we call them purposes, that are centered on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And one of them focuses on working towards a profession that does reflect society. And we see that as such an important part of where equity, diversity, and inclusion needs to go for the future.
Absolutely. As you were saying, engineers are serving the public. So we have to understand our public and understand what needs are needed and things like that. So the needs of one group will not be the same as the needs of another. So we need to have the diversity within the whole industry so that we can better serve the public, or else we risk leaving out these other groups and only allowing one group to move on with the innovations and with the technology that we're building. So that's something that's super important. Not only just because it's we want to be included, which we do, but it's also that we're looking out for our future as well. It's not just about I want to be an engineer. It's about I want to be an engineer to also be able to do things for people like me. So I think that's absolutely important, and some people sometimes don't see it that way. So I think that also brings us to the next question, talking about how environments can be toxic to a lot of people that deter them away from potentially entering this industry. So I wanted to turn it over to you, and what do you believe is more prevalent? Is it mostly the toxic environment that is deterring, or do you think it's actually the internal lack of confidence that we have because of the way that we've been brought up, the way that things aren't told to us? What do you believe is the, I guess, the greater force on women not entering the industry?
Yeah, definitely a great question, and I think something that a lot of folks wonder about. And we kind of get a question, or rather a comment around, well, if women aren't here, then they didn't want to be here in the first place. And to be honest, that's somewhat a counterproductive kind of way of thinking, right? Because to be honest, I think both of those questions, both the toxic environment and the stereotypes or the lack of confidence, are all external, caused by external messaging. And so what we do want to address isn't so much that we want to be careful not to think of it as females and women being having a deficit, that they need to change in some way. And I think we've had that kind of perspective in the past, is that, well, what we need to do is train women on being better leaders, on being able to negotiate their salaries better, on being more confident in the workplace, or feeling like they belong. And what I would suggest is rather it's the environment around them that has to change first. And because you can help somebody with some tools in terms of negotiating their salary, but if the environment around them continues to see them as not being technically savvy, as giving them opportunities that are not helping them grow as a professional and as a professional engineer, because we hear stories about young graduates and even women who are in their senior levels or mid-career. They're given more administrative tasks. They're not given those more technical tasks. And so if that is the case around them, it doesn't matter how confident they are, they will be seen as always being lesser than what the rest of the system is saying. This is what an engineer needs to be. And so we need to really address the system around them. We'll find that there is such a great emotional tax in being an underrepresented individual within a system. So whether it's being the only woman or being the only Black engineer in an environment where everyone else kind of sees you as an other, that's very taxing, and that makes that job so much harder for that individual. They have to try 150% in order to get the same accolades and the same salary as a white man who is their equal. So I don't know if I'm necessarily answering your question, but I think it is about the toxic environment. That's always where we want to try to address first. And it's not just we call it a culture of exclusion, and that we need to address that before we can have inclusion. And so by doing that, you have to do some things that are a bit difficult, which is the system and the leadership within workplaces and institutions needs to acknowledge that there is discrimination. That has to happen first, right? We have to acknowledge that there is an issue and that women and other underrepresented groups are not seen as equals, and that discrimination exists. And then what can we do to create more welcoming environments from there? How do we support them? How do we train the existing system to be different? And that means changing norms. That means doing training around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and also integrating that into the competencies and what's required of employees and managers, especially. I'll pass it over to Jeanette. I know you got lots to say too.
Great, thank you, Cassandra. So I had wanted to share that Engineers Canada knows that this isn't an area that any one organization can tackle by itself. And it's not an area that engineers as a profession can tackle by itself. We know that we need to work with experts in this field, experts from other disciplines, sociologists, psychologists, so many other experts. And so at Engineers Canada, we take the approach that on EDI, we're working with engineers and with our engineering volunteers. And myself, I'm an engineer at Engineers Canada, but we also know that we need expertise, subject matter expertise. So Cassandra is on our team bringing that subject matter expertise. And we feel that that's the only way that we're going to be able to make this change. So that's within Engineers Canada. Outside of Engineers Canada, we team with several different organizations. One of them is the Engendering Success in STEM Research Consortium, and they have a focus on identifying the key interventions that most effectively target the largest obstacles at each step along the continuum from early education to early career for girls and women in engineering. And one of the interesting things that they have tackled is at what age, and you talked about this in your question, at what age do young women, or in fact girls, start to feel as though they are not, that engineering is not going to be a potential career for them? And the Engendering Success in STEM Research Consortium has identified that that can happen as early as 6 or 7 years old. And as Cassandra mentioned, a great deal of that is the culture around the child. In fact, all of it is the culture around the child. So in addition to that, Engendering Success in STEM has looked at, well, what's happening in university? What's happening in employment or employer organizations? And again, and just going back to what Cassandra mentioned, it's that welcoming workplace. It's the welcoming culture. If there's a welcoming culture at the university or at the employer, that can lead to substantial change in removing the obstacles at that part of the continuum. The Engineering Success in STEM Research Consortium also is participating in longitudinal studies or leading longitudinal studies on this because they know that none of these challenges can be tackled with short-term um, short-term fixes. And so we participate on our end in short-term and long-term projects and partnerships in this area.
And I know I've experienced these things as well during my time. I want to say that I've seen, at least from when I was in high school until now, I want to say that I've seen a good change happening. Uh, I don't know if this is because, I'm a part of women in engineering. Am I seeing it more? Or has it actually, so for example, I started high school in 2010. Do you think between then till now there has been a positive change in the outlook on women in the industry?
So I'll start because I was in the industry in 2010, and I think that some of the differences that I see between 2010 and now are a broader understanding or a broader um, okay, I'll start with the word understanding, although I'm not quite sure it's quite the right word, of equity, diversity, inclusion, and the importance of issues such as that, and the importance of a organization-wide commitment to change, and the importance of the commitment of leaders to change. So when I think back to 2010, the kind of change that was thought that could potentially be effective was change that put the bulk of the responsibility for change on the shoulders of the women in the workplace. So, for example, there might be a women in engineering discussion group that was all made up of women in engineering, and any activities or action items were the responsibilities of those women. And there was not necessarily a commitment by the leadership or by the influencers or by the change makers within the organization to actually take what the Women in Engineering group was doing and to act on it, or to take the advice and to act on it. And in addition to that, there wasn't the widespread knowledge of the the language of equity, diversity, and inclusion that there is now. And back in 2010, if someone had used the term implicit or unconscious bias, or microaggression, or had even had experienced a microaggression, that kind of vocabulary and that broader knowledge in society just didn't exist. So perhaps, let's say someone experienced a microaggression, they wouldn't have known how to describe what it was they experienced, what the impact on them was, and why it was important that change needed to be made. So I believe that that's a big step forward. Even as recently as 2015, that terminology, the microaggression, implicit bias, unconscious bias, again, was not widely spread. So in more recent years, it's something that people can access information about and have conversations about much more than in the past. The other piece that I was going to say was that Canadian Federation of Engineering Students, who's one of our strategic partners, has at its conferences over the years, its conference on diversity and engineering, and also its leadership conference, had some great sessions on implicit bias, unconscious bias, microaggressions that I would say are just excellent, not only for students, but also professionals. So um, since then, also, there's a lot more research. There's a lot more research about identifying and a lot more information about what are the key obstacles. I think that in 2010, if someone had said, well, a welcoming workplace, um, or a welcoming university, or a welcoming culture can make such a big difference. They either would have been met with, oh, of course, but not really understanding what does welcoming mean, or they might have been laughed at because being welcoming might not have been perceived to be something that could make such great change.
I, to add to that, and I certainly, I'm not an engineer myself, but I've spoken to more engineers over the last 4 years than than I thought I would. And what I do hear is that there has been change in the workplace, and there have been some positive things, but at the same time, there continues to be these pockets and these experiences where women and underrepresented groups continue to face discrimination, harassment, to the point where they're leaving the profession. And what hopefully we're doing here, and this podcast is an example of it, is having these kind of conversations very openly and publicly, and acknowledging that there are problems. And so that's kind of the first step. And the next one is figuring out how do we effectively address it, and what are really the barriers to any progress. Because to be honest, there have been women in engineering committees and working groups and research for several decades now, but we haven't really figured out how to crack it, and what's been going on kind of under the hood in the profession. And what we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. That includes reaching out to smaller organizations, reaching out to those small consulting firms that are just staff of 5 to 10 people, and they might not have the capacity to do EDI training, or to talk about human resources in the same way that some of the larger companies do. But there are those same smaller firms who might have these incredible leaders, and these men as allies, who are creating incredibly welcoming environments, and who are enterprises where women and Indigenous engineers can thrive. And so I think that there is a movement, and there is a movement in broader society too, and a level of acknowledgement that we do need to address racism and sexism and all kinds of discrimination broadly, and in the work we do every day.
And that's incredibly encouraging. I know obviously we have ways to go from where we are now, but the fact that since from when I was in high school to now, there has been a change. It's encouraging to see that, yes, we can change people's thinking, but it is important that we show, even just showing it, that yes, we're doing something about this. We're going to encourage more people to not talk to you that way, to not bring up those comments. You're always going to have someone like that, but at least we can get the confidence going. Like I said, I've seen a change in my confidence from one point to another, just by being exposed to groups like Engineers Canada or OIQ. Concordia University as well have been very open to talking about these things, and always topics on diversity are everywhere now, and that's encouraging. And I think I'm hoping that maybe we have changed the way we talk to girls in high school or elementary schools, because from 2010 to 2018, so I'm in high school in CEGEP, no one even brought up engineering to me. So are there programs in place in schools that are actually pushing engineering, or even just STEM programs?
Yeah, there absolutely are, and I think that's an area that's really exploded, is the STEM outreach field. So there's a lot of organizations, whether it's coming straight from the universities, so they're doing their own outreach camps, like whether it's an engineering camp, or whether it's inviting students to participate and see what engineering is and means. And so they are working really hard on that, and we see some of the really great best practices coming out of university engineering outreach programs. Also the regulators, they're also some of them are very involved in doing outreach and doing camps and doing science and engineering Olympics, and still the bridge building activities, and creating a link between their members, the engineering professionals, and the schools. So you have this beautiful synergy of engineers who are either their parents, their grandparents. They want to give back to the younger generation, and they want to spark that interest. And so they certainly have that opportunity through the regulator to participate in school outreach programs. Engineers of Tomorrow is also an excellent example that really does a lot of good training for engineers, because engineers aren't teachers. They're not K-12 teachers. So you also have to make sure they have the right tools and language to talk to young kids not bore them, and not, not make it accessible too, right? So, and aside from that, I think there are groups talking to teachers themselves, looking at curriculum and how engineering can be part of curriculum, and talking about engineering not as just civil engineering or mechanical or electrical engineering, but as a way of thinking, as teaching engineering design. And we have a great partnership with a US-based outreach organization called Discover E, and their in-school competition called Future City that really is looking at design principles. And the goal isn't necessarily that all the students who participate in these programs goes on and enrolls in engineering, but rather is exposed to these ways of thinking, and it becomes part of their understanding of the world and gives them tools for whatever they end up doing into the future. So there's all kinds, and I should also mention Girl Guides. We've had a partnership with Girl Guides Canada, very, very broad reach. And they were particularly interested in designing and having an engineering related curriculum for a variety of their levels of guiding. So there's badges, and there's all kinds of things that you can get that are engineering related. So I think there's lots out there. The challenge is that it can be difficult if you're in a remote location. It can be difficult if you don't have access to these kind of things, and that does bring up socioeconomic disparities. And so that is an area that we do try to encourage discussion, and with things going virtual and online, it's almost made things more accessible. It's made engineering outreach more accessible to a lot of folks, but there certainly are still some large areas of the country that don't necessarily have access to these amazing maker spaces and STEM programs. But certainly it's more than when I went to public school and high school.
At least from my experience and from what I've spoken to other people, you were incredibly discouraged to even think of STEM programs if you don't have at least 80 or 90% in your courses. It was, there's no way you're doing that. Think of something else. And also, academic advisors, guidance counselors, it was really weak in the sense of encouraging people to explore their interests in STEM programs, no matter what grades you're having. I especially wouldn't want to be compared to my high school self in terms of my courses. Like, oh, in high school, these were your math and science grades, so that's how we're going to look at you now from now on. Those are kind of, not that they're irrelevant, but your high school grades don't really show what you have potential in, I believe. And so I was wondering if there was programs that you know of in place or that Engineers Canada is doing, or even have we come far enough that I guess like teachers or someone with authority is not pushing down students and saying, think of another program because engineering's not for you because you're not science savvy or you're not math savvy, you're 14 years old and you don't know how to do math, so you're not going to be an engineer type thing, because I know that was a huge thing and what deterred a lot of students, like not only women but everyone.
Well, I should mention our Explore Engineering website, where there actually are tools for students to just kind of it's kind of a little bit of a gamification of choosing what kind of discipline you would like to you'd be interested in. So there's also profiles of engineers. So it kind of goes around those gatekeepers, like you're mentioning, the counselors, the advisors, who might not be at a stage where they're encouraging young girls to, okay, so you didn't do great in calculus, but keep going, what is your interest in this area? What are the opportunities for you? And that is a conversation that needs to happen, and we do encourage that as well. But there are other tools that students can then go themselves to explore engineering and chart their own course and find out some details. And I know that there's other universities that also have other great websites that do talk about different disciplines in engineering and do present sort of the role models, because that is another challenge too. If you don't have an engineer in your family, how do you know about engineering? How do you know that this is an option, right? So if anybody's interested, exploreengineering.ca is a great website. Also, National Engineering Month is a time that all the regulators come together across the country, and it's March of each year. So if anyone is interested, listening to the podcast, look up National Engineering Month And there's a calendar usually in terms of looking at what kind of activities are available in your own country, your own province, in your own city, your jurisdiction. So lots going on in March to promote engineering nationally, for sure.
I wish I would have had something like that as a teenager myself. Instead of just, here's a career website where you can put in your answers and it'll give you a career you should do. And I ended up getting police officer to myself. I said, that's not what I want to do. So yeah, especially I'm glad to hear that. Like I said, it's incredibly deterring to have someone tell you that there's no way you're going to make it if you don't have 80% or more. And I've seen many engineers who don't, myself as well. We're not all getting 80%, 90% in our math courses anyways. That's not the criteria. It's really just understanding, but grades are important, but they're not they're not the end all of your career. On another note, there are resources out there being developed by groups, like I said, who have the power, like Engineers Canada, OIQ, or other regulators in Canada, the government. But what can individuals, say like myself or other professionals, other students, what can we do to help more women and help diversify the engineering industry?
So one of the key recommendations connects to the topic that we discussed earlier about creating a welcoming culture. And it talks about the commitment of leadership. So I would say that student leaders, like yourself, your colleagues, you're already making a difference in terms of changing the culture and increasing the things that are needed to be able to bring more women into engineering. Within the other groups to which you and your colleagues belong, working with the leaders in those groups to demonstrate their leadership commitment, not only to say it in words, but also to be able to take action. Another piece would be around the plans. It's one thing to be able to say, oh, I believe in equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's another thing to be able to take that commitment and to incorporate it into the actions for the student group or the professional organization, or to incorporate it into metrics to monitor progress or to put resources toward it. So I would say that that's another area. And another piece would be trying to better understand why it is that people stay. For example, why is it that women are staying in the student groups or in the professional organizations? Or why is it that women are not staying? And if they're not staying, why are they saying that they're leaving? Is it that they're feeling like even within the volunteer organization, there's some kind of a ceiling where above that ceiling, there's no opportunity for them to be able to gain a senior volunteer position, or within the professional association, maybe there's no opportunity for them to get to take the kind of path that they would like. And then finally, the other piece, and this is exactly what you're doing today, and we're so happy to be participating, is sharing and applying best practices. So individuals like yourself, individuals like your colleagues at Women in Engineering in Concordia, other students, other professionals, they can share what they have seen has worked, and they can apply and work to apply what they have seen has worked. So again, we're happy to share the link to that document. And even though it's called Guidance for Employers, it's actually applicable to any kind of organization.
A piece around maybe two pieces. One is around self reflection and taking time to reflect on our behaviors and our responses to things. And this is part of learning about unconscious bias and learning about our own positions in our workplaces, in our peer groups, with other students, but really trying to understand our positionality, and that relates to what kind of privilege we bring. Myself as a woman of color who's come from a first generation experience, immigrant family, I know I also have a lot of of privilege as the access I had to post-secondary education, the kind of opportunities that I had. But I know other areas where I didn't get that kind of step up, and others might have. So having this opportunity to make space, ensuring that I learn about how to make some of the programming I do more accessible, understanding what kind of barriers folks with disabilities have in terms of accessing my conferences, understanding why there aren't any Indigenous folks in my committees, looking at where the gaps are, who's not in the spaces that I'm involved in, and why is that the case? So I think taking a second to do our own self-reflection, understanding that we all have a lot of learning and unlearning to do. It does take a certain level of humility too, and being okay with failure. And that is one of the hardest parts, and that it takes time and it's a process, that creating an inclusive engineering profession is going to take time. But it is something that we can't lose our sights on, and can't lose our motivation on, and that we can all do it together as a collective, and that we're all going to falter sometimes. So it's okay if we point out, you know what, Cassandra, what you said actually did offend me. What you said didn't really sit well with me. Can you improve? And you didn't use my correct pronouns. Can you try that next time? Can you make sure that you do that? And being able to step back and say, you're absolutely right, I made a mistake. So being okay with weakness, and having that time and space to do that, it can be really challenging. I also acknowledge, as students, you're under an incredible amount of pressure, and there is a sense of competition too, that you kind of have to win your way to some particular position. But I think if we are asking these questions and we want true answers, in terms of how do we create inclusive and welcoming environments, we have to also be interested in making some of those personal commitments, and reflecting on where we're at, and what kind of impact we have on others. So
That's definitely a great wrap up, is to constantly share your stories, talk about it, and then other people can realize either the privilege they have in comparison to others, and where, like you said, Cassandra, where are these gaps falling? What are we missing? What is going on that I wasn't able to see? Or someone, my colleague, experiencing the exact same path as me, we're still going to be at different areas in life and how we experience life. So that's I think it's a great wrap up of the topic today, is really to keep the momentum going, keep talking about this. And it seems to be working from what I've seen. And like you said, these terms are coming into play, and we understand more and more on what goes on. So thank you so much, both to you, Cassandra and Jeanette, for being here today. And thank you to our audience for joining and tuning in to our episode today. And we'll see you on a next episode of The Iron Ring.